Hola! Thank you for inviting me to give a short talk here at the third International Symposium on Spirituality in Clinical Practice. I'm also grateful to Simona and Leandro for inviting me to speak at the end of their talk on mindfulness in the mind-body dialogue. So Simona asked me to talk about what self-compassion is and say something about the 8-week mindful self-compassion training program, and then also to address something about the role of self-compassion in the mind-body dialogue. So for starters, what is self-compassion? Well, self-compassion can be informally defined as treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would treat somebody whom we truly love when they're suffering, when things have gone wrong in their lives. So, we do that quite naturally to others. But when things go wrong in our own lives, we are often not so sympathetic, not so compassionate. Self-compassion is, especially self-compassion training, helps us to cultivate the capacity to, as it were, slip ourselves into the circle of compassion, to include ourselves in the circle of compassion and to be as kind to ourselves as we are to others. The research certainly shows that most people nowadays are much kinder to others, especially particular others, than they are to themselves when things go wrong, when we suffer, when we fail, when we feel inadequate. So that's what self-compassion is. There are many misunderstandings about self-compassion. Some people think it's like self-pity or self-indulgence, or it will rob you of your motivation, or it will make you weak. But the research shows, and there are 1,600 studies in the research, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. In fact, one researcher, Mark Leary, said that the research in self-compassion is now getting boring because it's associated with just about every measure of emotional well-being that we have. Self-compassion is also, in its relationship to mindfulness, perhaps understood best as the attitude or the beating heart of mindfulness when we suffer or fail, when we are caught in the grip of challenging emotions. So usually when we think of mindfulness, we think of kind of moment-to-moment, accepting, non-judgmental awareness. But when we experience an emotion like shame or despair, we have a lot of difficulty turning toward the experience because it's so painful. And we know in our own daily lives that when we are in such an emotional state, if somebody comes over to us and gives us a beautiful hug and talks to us in a kind way, in other words, is compassionate, then we start to settle down and we can actually begin to pay attention to what's bothering us in life. So similarly, mindfulness can be understood as loving awareness of moment-to-moment experience, and compassion is a loving awareness of the experiencer. Sometimes we need to hold ourselves in a kind embrace before we can actually hold our experience. So the MSc program, this 8-week training program for self-compassion, was created in order to explicitly and on purpose bring the elements of kindness and compassion into our awareness, particularly then so that we will have the capacity to work with difficult experience. In my own life, for example, I suffered from public speaking anxiety for 20 years at the same time as I was practicing mindfulness, but I could never make room. I could never make space or room or accept the anxiety because there was something underlying it that I was unable to face, and that was shame. If I was giving a lecture on mindfulness and I was trembling so much that I couldn't speak, that was such a shameful thing for me because it meant I was fraudulent, I was stupid, and I was incompetent. So in my own life, once I started to practice loving kindness meditation, particularly for myself, just as I am, the shame began to disappear, and then I could speak in public, and I was more resilient, and I didn't worry so much whether people would actually like me because I was able to support myself from the inside. So self-compassion is a powerful emotional resource, especially as an antidote to shame, just as mindfulness is a powerful resource. And together, they are a wonderful combination for living our lives more fully and also for emotional balance, well-being, and for thriving. We like to say that mindfulness and self-compassion are BFF, best friends forever. They're like a beautiful dance. We need them both. We need mindfulness for self-compassion training because self-compassion training can be emotionally activating. There's a saying, when you give yourself unconditional love, you discover the conditions under which you were not loved, or love reveals everything unlike itself. More so than mindfulness training, compassion training drops us into the relational matrix of our lives. It directly speaks to our attachment styles. If we have insecure attachment, if we have anxious attachment, if we have disorganized attachment, we can actually learn to reparent ourselves with the power of self-compassion because we are more capable of giving ourselves the unconditional love that we may have needed as children. So this is one of the things that people learn to do in the MSc or Mindful Self-Compassion Training Program. The program actually has three main components, which correspond to the three components of self-compassion that Kristen Neff came up with in 2003 when she made the self-compassion scale. Those three components are mindfulness, common humanity, or a sense that I'm not alone, especially when we suffer. And the third component is self-kindness, treating ourselves with the same kindness as we would treat others. Finally, Simona asked me to address the mind-body relationship, how it is cultivated in self-compassion training. And the mind-body relationship is very important. First of all, emotions have a mental and a physical component, but what we find in self-compassion, because it is so emotionally activating, that in order to regulate those emotions, the easiest way is to find the emotion in the physical body. For example, anger may be in the stomach, or despair or loss in the heart. Some people feel shame in the head. To find the emotion in the physical body and then to relate to that part of the body with compassion. And this actually manages to transform the emotion itself without having to chase around thoughts, thoughts are so quick that sometimes it's much harder in order to stabilize our awareness if we remain in our heads. We also learn to anchor our awareness in the physical body when we are emotionally activated. And we have an exercise called Soles of the Feet, where you actually just feel the soles of your feet. We say it works because it is the farthest point, the furthest distance from the head, and still be in the physical body. But we have many other ways of working with the body. But the idea is that when you can identify an emotion in the body where it often appears before we can think about it very much, that it provides a powerful form of emotion regulation. So that's probably enough for now. I hope that there was something interesting in this little talk. Perhaps you've become a little curious about self-compassion. If you're interested, you can go to a website, which is centerformsc.org, and download all kinds of materials, meditations, and home practices, whatever you like. So I hope that you have a lovely rest of the conference, and I hope that this was helpful in some way. Thank you.